Okay. Welcome to this class on one of the two tough letters by Paul to congregations he founded. He may have written other tough letters. We just don't have them. But anyway, the other tough letter, and a tougher letter than this one, is 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. That is a tougher letter than this one and is kind of nastier than this one. That letter, 10 through 13 of 2 Corinthians, possibly with 1 Corinthians 9, 1 through 18, stuck in the middle of it, as we have argued, that is referred to as the slashing attack that Paul wrote to the Corinthians after he had made the painful second visit, during which time he was rejected as the apostle of the church in Corinth by the majority of the Corinthian church members. And so then he wrote 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, and then that did the trick, that solved the problem. And then later he wrote 2 Corinthians letter G, which was 2 Corinthians 1:1 through 2:13 plus 7:5 through 16, which is where he sort of says, well, yeah, I wrote you a severe letter, but it was a letter that I wrote with much anguish of heart and with many tears, as he says in 2:4. But you needed it, and it did some good. It's kind of like a kid being spanked by the parents, and the dad or the mom saying, "This is hurting me a lot more than it's hurting you." Anyway, that's a tougher letter than this one. But Galatians is an earlier letter, and in Corinth, the problem was not circumcision. The problem was not Judaism versus Gentiles in Corinth. They were outside agitators. And in this letter, the problem was Paul had founded the churches of Galatia, note the plural, and they were Gentile churches, probably exclusively Gentile churches. And so he had not told them about Torah obedience. He had not told them about being circumcised because they were Gentiles, and that was just not in the picture. They had already had this big meeting in Jerusalem, the Apostolic Conference, or the Jerusalem Conference, in which it had been decided that Gentiles didn't need to be circumcised. And so Paul narrates that in chapter 2 of this letter. So the Galatian letter, the letter to the Galatians, the bad guys were not the Galatians. The bad guys were the outside agitators who came in. And so we'll hear a little bit more about that. Galatians is an earlier letter, and this is the first letter that Paul introduces his theology of justification by faith. And so before Galatians, if Paul has a theology of justification by faith, we don't have any evidence of it. Were there other tough letters that Paul wrote? Well, we just don't know. But we have to proceed on the basis of the evidence we have. And here's our schedule. So we'll talk about the circumcision controversy, which I've just done. We'll talk about the Jerusalem Conference, and we'll talk about the Antioch Incident. And we'll go all the way to 2:14. And then next Sunday we'll go further. The 21st I won't be here, and then we have the Sunday after Thanksgiving. We'll continue up through December 12th, and you have that on your list of your handout. This letter, Galatians, is one of the 4 letters in the Pauline corpus whose authorship by Paul himself has never been doubted, or virtually never been doubted. There was a very radical group of people in the Netherlands in, I suppose, the early 19th century or the late 19th century who didn't believe Paul wrote any of the letters. But nonetheless, nobody else. And so the other 3 letters of the most hardcore Pauline letters are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. And the father of modern Pauline studies in 1845 believed these 4 were authentic letters of Paul, and he didn't believe the others were. We now all unanimously believe that Paul wrote Philippians. We certainly believe that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, and we believe that Paul wrote Philemon. And the other letters that we have problems with, Paul writing them, are the three Deuteropauline letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. And then the three pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And there are some very good reasons for that, but we don't need to deal with that here. What makes Galatians such a tough letter? You and I, may have experienced old-fashioned Sunday school as little kids or even teenagers by people who didn't really know much about the New Testament. And you and I may actually harbor the idea that everybody in the early church always got along with each other. As we know, people in church always get along with each other, don't they? Well, when you and I study most of the letters of Paul, we encounter the reality that several of Paul's letters reflect substantial conflict by people who deeply disagreed with each other. And this reality sometimes bugs readers of Paul. They just can't really believe that everything in the early church was not all hunky-dory all the time. And so if you have these old-fashioned, rather too pious ideas about Paul and his letters or about the early church, you will be very unhappy with my class. Anyway, then of course, the big question is, who were the earliest believers in Jesus? Well, the earliest believers in Jesus were the 12 apostles. And they were all Jews, including Jesus, including Paul. By the time Paul wrote the Galatian churches, those Jews who were followers of Jesus had not yet, shall we say, broken off relations with other Jews. In other words, there had not yet been a break between Jews who were followers of Jesus and other Jews. And so by the time Paul wrote Galatians, the Gentile churches were not really well established. And so that's why these people came into Paul's Galatian churches and told the men they needed to be circumcised. And they even agreed to it. And then Paul heard about it and he wrote this letter, okay? And so we believe that this letter was written in 53. My teacher dated it in 53 in his chronology book. And we also believe that the conference that's described in Galatians 2, 1 through 10 is the Jerusalem conference, which is also the conference that's described in Acts 15. And so the reason for the Jerusalem conference was there were people who went to Paul's churches, like in Antioch, and saw these Gentiles not keeping kosher and not being circumcised, and they went fairly bananas on that point. And so the objection by some Jewish Christians against Paul and his churches, Paul and Barnabas and their churches, were that these Gentiles were not keeping kosher and they were not being circumcised. They were not keeping the law of Moses. They were not keeping Torah. And so that was the reason for the Jerusalem conference. Okay, and then we hear about the Jerusalem conference in chapter 2. It's also in Acts 15. There are differences in the way it's told. And the issue is whether Gentile Christian believers were obliged to keep the law of Moses, and especially the command to circumcise males. Okay, let's go on. Fred, would you read this 1 through 5? Here, let me give you one of these. And you have to shout.
Okay. I, Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ, and God the Father who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Grace to you and peace from God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins, that he might deliver us from the present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen.
Okay. That part of the letter is what form critics call the epistolary prescript. It's the stuff that's at the beginning of a letter. Usually the beginning of the letter is like A to B and greetings. Paul expands that by saying Paul and his honorific titles. To the Galatians, he doesn't use the Galatians' honorific titles in verse 2. And then grace to you and peace. The normal greeting of a letter is kairein. And Paul modifies that to say charis humin kai erene, grace to you and peace. So he takes the normal greeting, salutation of a letter and modifies it, and then he adds shalom, he adds peace. And who was Jesus? He gave himself for our sins to deliver us from the present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father. So that is the epistolary prescript, and it's at the beginning of virtually all Hellenistic letters. Paul expands it to include this grace and peace thing. And then he also expands honorific titles, although in this case, not the honorific titles of the Galatians. In speeches, at the beginning of a speech, we call that in Greek a prooimion, and in Latin it's called an exordium. And one of the things that you should do at the beginning of a speech is that you are trying to introduce yourself to your audience, and you're especially trying to gain the goodwill of the audience. Because if you don't gain the goodwill of the audience, they're not going to listen to the rest of your speech, okay? So frequently in Paul's letters, in fact in all of Paul's letters but this one, Paul says honorific things about the people who are receiving his letters. That's a conventional thing. That convention, however, Paul throws in the trash can in this letter. He doesn't say honorific things about them. In fact, he curses them. And then later in 3:1, he says, "Oh, mindless Galatians." The RSV says they're foolish, but they're actually anoitai. Well, if you're anoitai, if you're anoitos, it means you either have no nous, which is your mind, or you have no noemata, which are thoughts. So I would say mindless or brain dead would be about right. But the RSV and unfortunately the NRSV is a little too diplomatic here. Paul basically does the opposite of trying to gain the goodwill of the audience. This was expected in both speeches and in letter writing. And so you can say that Paul got the attention of his readers in this letter. Would you like to read the next few verses all the way through verse 9? Chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. And you have to shout.
Because you can't hear?
Because we're trying to make a recording of it.
Oh. Okay.
This is a $1,200 video camera.
I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to that which you received, let him be accursed.
How about that? Is that clear enough? Paul has made himself clear to the Galatians, right? So those who come under the curse of Paul, and presumably since Paul speaks for God, they come under the curse of God. They are the people who proclaim a different gospel. And of course, in verse 6 he says, you are quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ. That's Paul. They're deserting Paul. And they're turning to a different gospel. Okay? But there really is no other gospel. And so anybody who turns to this other gospel, which is no gospel at all, let that person go to hell. Okay? I guess you could translate it in verse 8, let that person go to hell, and then in verse 9 you could say, let that person go straight to hell. Somehow we don't do that in church. What is Paul talking about? Well, what different gospel are we talking about? Well, the different gospel was that if you want to become a believer in Christ and you are male, you've got to be circumcised because you are trying to enter into the covenant of Abraham. And Paul was saying that ain't part of the deal at all. You know, you're not entering into the covenant of Abraham through circumcision. And therefore, you don't have to become a Jew or a quasi-Jew in order to be a Christian. By the way, the gospel that he refers to is not a written work that includes the life of Jesus. It refers to the singular message of the death and resurrection of Christ. In the year 53, there was only one gospel and not four. There's no work that is the gospel according to Mark or Matthew or Luke or John or anybody else. There's only one gospel, and that is the oral message of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. No book such as Mark or Matthew was called a gospel at that time. The gospel was something proclaimed rather than a book written down. So then in 11 and 12, he says the gospel was not of human origin. Let me read that. I'm looking at 1:11 and 12. For I would have you know, brethren, by the way, we call that a disclosure formula. I want you to know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not a human gospel. For I did not receive it from a human being, nor was I taught it. He says the same thing in verse 1 of chapter 1. I didn't receive it from human beings, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my, well, he goes on. So Paul says he got his gospel, the only one there is, directly from Jesus Christ, not from the Jerusalem church, and not from Peter or any other apostle. Paul claims to be an apostle equal in stature with the original 12 apostles of Jesus, minus Judas Iscariot. He claims to be, actually Paul thinks he is the chief apostle to Gentiles. The other 11 apostles, 12 if you count Matthias, those other apostles are associated with the Jerusalem church, and they, as we'll find out after the Jerusalem conference, they go into all the world and they preach to fellow Jews. Paul is a Jew and he preaches to Gentiles, as we'll find out. Now, if you would read, Fred, verses 13 and 14.
For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. Okay, the RSV and the NRSV translate this as my earlier life in Judaism. And this implies that Paul is not in Judaism anymore. And this is saying a little bit more than the Greek text actually says. The text actually says, you have heard of my manner of life when I was in Judaism. It doesn't actually say earlier. Plata means, it can mean earlier, but it can mean at a particular time. So it means you have heard of my life when I was in Judaism, in the institution of Judaism. But Paul does not actually say that he is not actually in Judaism, being a Jew now. Okay? What did Paul do when he was in Judaism? Well, he persecuted the church. He persecuted Jesus believers. And he also advanced in Judaism beyond many of his same age. Does this mean that Paul spent time studying Torah or Jewish tradition? Very good question. Now, in the book of Acts, Paul goes to Jerusalem and studies with the famous liberal rabbi Gamaliel in Jerusalem. But we don't know anything about that. And looking at Paul's Greek text, there is no real trace of a person whose mother tongue was Aramaic, and certainly few, if anybody's mother tongue was Hebrew. Jesus' mother tongue was Aramaic. And the Greek of Paul's, the text of Paul's Greek does not look like his mother tongue was anything other than Greek. So if Paul went to Jerusalem and studied with Gamaliel, the famous liberal rabbi in Jerusalem, presumably he would have been speaking Aramaic. But the actual text of Paul does not suggest that. And so that's one of the problems of Acts says one thing about Paul, and the letters of Paul with the actual Greek text
kind of say something else. And so we've talked about that before, namely the text of Paul is the primary source. Anything that anybody other than Paul says about Paul is a secondary source. And so if you think Paul really did go to Jerusalem and studied the Torah or studied Jewish tradition with Gamaliel, then you're preferring a secondary source over a primary source. And so we think that's very difficult. And so people in my line of work, we used to kind of try to train people to read the Greek text, read the real text of Paul, and then give that the primary weight, and then anything else, weight that in a secondary way. But what does he mean? He advanced in Judaism beyond many of his same age. Well, maybe he did study Torah. If he was in Tarsus, Tarsus had 7 Stoic philosophers who their hometown and where they taught was Tarsus. Paul could have studied Stoic philosophy, and in the latter part of chapter 1 of Romans, Paul seems to use Stoic Greek terminology. So exactly what Paul's background was educationally, and not ethnically, but educationally, what his background was and where he would fit within Judaism somewhere, that's a matter that people like me go to meetings and we debate this, okay? So let's go on to Paul getting called as an apostle. Would you read the next 2 verses, 15 and 16, Terry?
But when he who had set me apart before I was born and had called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia, and again I returned to Damascus.
Okay, Paul is saying in verse 15, God revealed his Son in me, in emoi, which can mean either in me or to me. And it was always a part of God's plan, Paul says, to reveal Jesus to Paul. It was always a part of God's plan to call Paul as an apostle. And in verse 16, maybe the most important verse in Paul, what was the purpose of revealing Jesus to Paul? Quote, that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. So in Galatians 1:16, Paul says his mission from God, quite literally, was that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. This is Paul's self-understanding of his mission, and note that it says nothing whatsoever about any ministry to Jews. Now, when Paul writes Romans, that gets modified a little bit. But certainly in the earliest letter that Paul wrote, 1 Thessalonians, in chapter 1, verse 9, he says, they tell great things about you, Thessalonians, and how you turn to God from idols. Now, if you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God, 1 Thessalonians 1:9, that strongly says that you, Thessalonians, the recipients of the earliest letter, were Gentiles, not Jews. So this is one more stone in the wall. This is one more brick in the wall that says that Paul's churches, before he writes Romans, are generally, if not completely, Gentile churches. Okay? So, what happened? Well, 1:16, after Paul was called by God, what did Paul do? He did not confer with flesh and blood. He didn't get any information from other Christians. He did not go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me. Paul went at once into Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. Now, was it Damascus that Paul, on the Damascus, in Acts, on the Damascus road, Paul was called as an apostle? And in stained glass windows, Paul gets knocked off his horse. Now, you won't find that horse in the Bible. But Paul gets knocked off his horse in stained glass windows. But anyway, instead of conferring with anybody in the Jerusalem church, instead of conferring with any of the other apostles, he did not do it. And therefore, he went at once into Arabia and finally returned to Damascus. Okay, let's go on. Then, verse 18, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. Cephas is the Aramaic form of Petros, which means rock. Okay? So, presumably Cephas, which is Aramaic, is the same as Petros in Greek. So Paul went up and went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. This is the acquaintance visit. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. By the way, Paul has not heard about the virginal conception of Jesus. No early Christian writer has, other than Matthew and Luke. And so Jesus has got brothers and sisters. And then he says, in what I am writing you, I do not lie. So he went later in verse 21, I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. Cilicia is where Tarsus is, right? Syria is where Damascus is. And let's go on. Verse 22, I was still not known by sight to the churches of Christ in Judea. Nobody knew who I was. Now, if Paul had been a student of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, you would think that there would be people in Jerusalem who would recognize Paul by sight. But you see, the problem is reading Acts into Paul. That's your big problem. So what did Paul do? Verse 23 here. They only heard it said, the churches of Christ who are in Judea. In other words, Jewish Christian churches. They only heard it said, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they glorified God because of me. Okay? So, they didn't know him by sight. They didn't know who he was, but they had heard that he had been persecuting people. And of course, in Acts, you have the stoning of Stephen, and Saul, Shaul, who became Paul, held their coats. Now let's go on to the Jerusalem conference. Fred, how about 2:1 through 10?
Okay. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus also with me. And I went up by revelation and communicated to them that the gospel which I preach among privately to those who privately to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And this occurred because of false brethren secretly brought in, who came in by sleep to spy out our liberty, which we really have in Christ Jesus, that we might bring us into bondage, to whom we did not yield submission even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But from those who seemed to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man. For those who seemed to be something added nothing to me. But on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel of the circumcised had been committed to me as the gospel for the circumcised was to Peter. For he who worked effectively for Peter for the apostleship to be circumcised also worked effectively to me toward the Gentiles. And with James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived that the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. But they desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I was eager to do.
Okay, this is the narration of the Jerusalem conference, or the apostolic conference. Note that in 1:18, Paul says that after 3 years, he went 3 years after his calling as an apostle. Paul does not refer to himself as having been converted. Paul refers to himself as having been called. So after 3 years, you had the acquaintance visit to Paul in Jerusalem. And then, 2:1, after 14 years, are we adding the 14 to the 3? Most of us think we should. Not everyone does. But after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. Barnabas, of course, the bar is Aramaic for son of, like Ben in Hebrew is son of, or son. Bar is Aramaic. Took Titus along with me. He was not called on the carpet. I went up by revelation. He was not called on the carpet by people whom he considered his superiors. Paul does not consider that he has any superiors other than God, okay? I laid before them privately, before those who were of repute, to the big shots. I laid before them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, lest somehow I should be running or had run in vain. Well, what does that mean? Well, it was a private meeting. Everybody in the Jerusalem church did not hear Paul speak. By the way, in Acts, there are no direct quotations from Paul, as there are from Peter and James. And why did he do it? Well, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. Does this imply Paul had doubts, or merely that he wanted to just completely make doubly sure that he was teaching about Christ in the right way? I don't think, as I read Paul, I don't find Paul having doubts. So I think Paul wanted to sort of like, I'm giving this to you and I want a receipt. You know, I want to make sure you agree that what I say about the gospel to the Gentiles is hunky-dory. And by the way, he laid it before them, and even Titus, who was with me, was not compelled to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Now, in in Acts, Paul circumcises Timothy. Did you know that? But in Galatians, Paul makes a big deal about Titus not being needed. It was not needed that Paul needed to be circumcised, even though, in fact, the Galatians have been compelled by Paul's opponents to be circumcised. So Titus didn't need to be circumcised even in Jerusalem. So you guys in Galatia, listening to these agitators, these outside people, you agreed to be circumcised, but you know, my right-hand man Titus, being a Gentile, was not compelled to be circumcised, okay? Now, what happened? We did not submit to them even for an hour. Now, the RSV says a moment, but it's an hour. Why? Chapter 2, verse 5, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. In other words, if I agreed to submit to them even for a moment, then that would have kind of messed you Gentiles up in the Gentile churches. That would suggest that there was something somehow illegitimate about the Gentile churches, which Paul is never going to agree to. And then verse 6, I love this. And from those who were reputed to be something, the people who alleged to be big shots. And then parenthetically, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. I don't care what they say about themselves. But from the supposed leaders, the so-called big shots, those I say who were of repute, they added nothing to me. They did not say that Paul had to do anything else than he was already doing in terms of Paul's theology or in terms of Paul's practice, i.e. not circumcising Gentile men. They added nothing to me. That's what it means. And so everything's hunky-dory. It was agreed, by the way, that Peter and company had been entrusted with the gospel. This is a divine passage, by the way. God entrusted Peter and company with the gospel to the circumcised. And Barnabas and Paul were entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised. By the way, this is what's called a comity agreement. In other words, we will stay in our territory and you stay in your territory. Paul's territory is Gentile churches. Peter and company's territory is Jews. Okay? So, what happened? Verse 10. They ask only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. Now, if you read other Pauline letters, such as 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, you will read that Paul is asking people to bring money to the church for the relief of Jerusalem Christians. And so bring money, you Gentiles, bring money. The people in Jerusalem are having a hard time right now. So bring money to relieve these Jerusalem Christians, who, by the way, are Jews. You Gentiles bring the money, and we will give that money to the Jerusalem church to relieve their needs. And Paul asked the Corinthians for money, and apparently didn't get it from the Corinthians. Paul asked the Galatians for money, and we have no evidence that the Galatians gave any money for the relief of the Jerusalem church. Isn't that interesting? But this is the origin of Paul's offering for the relief of the Jerusalem church. They ask only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do. Okay? It was almost my own idea. How about that? So let's go on. Anybody know about politics in the 21st century church? Politics in the church didn't just start happening in our century. Okay? Now, let's go on and read about the Antioch Incident. Fred, how about you? 2:11 through 14.
Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I stood with him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you being a Jew live in the manner of Gentiles and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews?
Okay, the Antioch Incident. Well, in 1979, Professor Hans-Dieter Betz at the University of Chicago had spent 10 years or more, I suppose, writing a commentary on Galatians, which was in the Hermeneia series. And it came out toward the end of the year, I think in December, it came out in 79. I was there when it came out. And one of the things that Professor Betz argued was that Galatians was in one of the genera of rhetoric. There's judicial rhetoric, in which you prosecute and defend. That's the rhetoric of the law courts. There's epidictic rhetoric, which is ceremonial rhetoric, and you praise or blame. Funeral orations are the most important kind of epidictic speech. And then there is deliberative rhetoric, which is the rhetoric of the council, and it is political rhetoric. In deliberative rhetoric, you use primarily the topics of advantage and honor. In other words, do this because it'll be of advantage to you, or do it because it's the right thing. In epidictic rhetoric, the major thing you do is praise or blame, mostly praise. And in judicial rhetoric, the major thing you do is you either defend or you prosecute, right? And I would say that there ain't no doubt that in 2:11 through 14, what Paul is doing here is not defending himself. What Paul is doing here is prosecuting Peter, okay? This is part of the narratio of the speech, of this letter. When Cephas came to Antioch, in other words, Antioch is a Gentile church. Even in the book of Acts, Antioch is the first church in which the disciples are called Christians because they were not Jews. See, it's a Gentile church. When Cephas came to Antioch, this Gentile church that Barnabas and I have been ministering to, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he ate with the Gentiles. He didn't keep kosher. But when they came, the people came from James, the brother of the Lord, in Jerusalem. When they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And with him, the rest of the Jews acted insincerely, that even included Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is the Greek word, and the old RSV calls it insincerity. See, they're being a little bit too diplomatic here. But anyway, Paul says in verse 14, when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, in other words, if you haven't been keeping kosher, you haven't been keeping the dietary laws, how can you compel Gentiles to live like Jews when actually you're not doing it? See, this is hypocrisis. It's an act. A krites is a judge, and judges were people who judged when people did theater productions. And so to be a hypocrites means to be an actor. And so we get the word hypocrisy from it, but basically he's saying that, Peter, you're putting on a show in front of the Jewish believers from Jerusalem. And so other Jews who were there of the circumcision faction joined Peter in this hypocrisy. Even Barnabas, who was an apostle in the church in Antioch before Paul was. How about that? So, Paul says, I saw that they were not acting consistently with the gospel, and so I said to Peter in front of them all, and you heard what he said. So anyway, that's what we're really looking at. And so in 2:11 through 14, this is called the Antioch Incident. And so Paul is not defending himself here, as I don't think he defends himself in this letter at all. I think he really prosecutes. And so if Professor Betts is right that this is judicial rhetoric, which many people doubt, many other people think that it has elements of deliberative rhetoric. That's very debatable. But nonetheless, Paul certainly seems to be prosecuting Peter here by saying, it ain't me that's in the wrong, it's Peter. And the reason that the church is all messed up in Galatia, in other words, even before the agitators came in and told the men in these different churches they needed to be circumcised, which caused quite an uproar apparently, and Paul heard about it, which is why he wrote this letter. The peace of the church has been disturbed, and the people that disturbed the peace of the church were the agitators that came in from the outside, and Peter even joined them, and even my missionary partner Barnabas joined them in this hypocrisy. How about that? So this gives you a little foretaste of what Paul is going to say in 3:1 of this letter. O mindless Galatians, O brain-dead Galatians, who bewitched you? So this is not a friendly letter. This is calling the Galatian Christians on the carpet. We have about 5 minutes, 6 minutes for questions or comments or rebuttals, if you would like. I'll even put my glasses on.
Are you familiar with the thought that Barnabas knew Paul previous to the conversion because they attended the school of Gamaliel together? Have you heard that?
I've never heard that.
I read it in a Wikipedia article. That's where I heard it. I've never heard it.
Well, they're assuming that Paul really did study with Gamaliel. And I raise questions about that. So I take the kind of radical view that if it's in Paul, you don't doubt it, and if it's in Paul and in Acts, you don't doubt it. But if it's in Acts alone, then it's in a secondary source, and I think that a lot has been written about the problem of Acts as a secondary source in relation to the stuff about Paul in Acts in relation to the stuff about Paul and Paul. So I have doubts that Paul really did study with Gamaliel in Jerusalem. And I think Paul, he even says, I was not known by sight to the churches of Christ which are in Judea. Which, if he had been a student of Gamaliel, the famous liberal rabbi in Jerusalem, it seems to me that you would expect that there would be people in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem church, or in and around Jerusalem, who would know Paul by sight if he had been a student of Gamaliel. So I personally doubt that Paul was a student of Gamaliel. If there was even a single word about it in Paul, I wouldn't doubt it. But if it's only in Acts, I think it's kind of problematic. That would include Paul circumcising Timothy. That would include Paul giving money to people who were keeping a Nazirite vow. Acts also only refers to Paul and Barnabas as apostles, kind of en passant, in passing. And you see, when they need a new 12th apostle after after Judas's death, they say we need somebody who has been with the Lord Jesus. In other words, somebody who had connections with Jesus during his earthly life and can be a witness with us to his resurrection. And so that definition of an apostle, that somebody who was with Jesus, is a definition that cuts out both Barnabas and Paul. So Paul and Barnabas are only mentioned like once or twice in Acts as being apostles, and only kind of like, well, with the other apostles. There's not a big deal. Acts does not make a big deal about Paul having the title apostolos. So that sets Acts over against what Paul says about himself. So that therein lies the problem, is what do you do with Acts? The very famous book about this was written by a person who became an Episcopalian named John Knox, and it was called Chapters in a Life of Paul. And in that, in 1950, he raised big issues about the use of the material from Acts in putting together an understanding of the life of Paul. So that has been a big issue in the meetings I go to say the least.
John Knox went from being a firebrand Presbyterian to a peaceful...
That's a different John Knox.
It's a different one.
The one he is the one that brought Calvinism to England, that John Knox.
Yeah.
In about the 17th century or 18th century. This John Knox was born in the 20th century, and he taught at Emory, and then he got a promotion, and he went to Union in New York. And when he went to Union in New York, he was a Methodist minister. He started going to an Episcopal church near Union, which was an interracial church. And he was so moved by it being an interracial church that he became an Episcopalian and was ordained in this church. So his book, which was published in 1950, is called Chapters in a Life of Paul. And recently, the Liberal Baptists reprinted it at Mercer. But it was published originally by Abingdon Press. But that's a different John Knox. But he taught at Union, and then he retired, and I think he may have taught a little while at the seminary in Austin, perhaps. But he taught for a long, long time. He was a student of Edgar Goodspeed at the University of Chicago. His dissertation was called Philemon Among the Letters of Paul. So he was one of the leading Paul scholars in the world. Any other questions? That's more than you wanted to know about John Knox.
It's good to know there's more than one John Knox.
John Knox is the one that brought Presbyterianism, or brought Calvinism per se, to England, and that's how they got Presbyterians. And then in 1662, when they passed the 1662 prayer book, which included bishops, priests, and deacons, and they passed the ornaments rubrics that says you wear the same vestments as you wore in King Henry's son, Edward, over 1,000 Puritan priests in the church, over 1,000 Puritan ministers quit the Church of England. And so they refer to 1662 not as the year of the Book of Common Prayer. They refer to it as the year of the Great Ejection, because 1,000 Puritan ministers left the Church of England because they were ejected from it because they refused to use the 1662 prayer book. How about that? All right. Isn't it wonderful how we Christians love each other? All right, well, I better quit now and get rest.